loss. I think there is a deeper sense of an experienced loss. And I think there is a deeper sense of maybe retribution for 400 years of slavery and genocide. And I don't think you can wipe that away, because I think it just kind of, it's part of the DNA as it gets fed through from one generation to the next that is there in the unconscious.
Spiritual awakening is just the beginning. Spiritual actualization is the evolution. I am Will Rucker, and this is Spiritual Actualization. Let's get into it.
All right. Well, Ken, let's go ahead and just get into it.
Okay.
The first thing I want to tackle is really the subject of how do you, as a cisgender white male, feel right now in this climate where Black Lives Matter has literally taken over everything?
I feel like something is really emerging. Something's emerging culturally in this community, in this state, in this country, in the world. And it's tapping into something that resonated with me, 50 years ago. Because I'm an old guy and I've been around a long time. And something about the 70s, my first job with the city of Minneapolis around racism, I struggled with at that time. And so it's been something that's been forming. And to me, at this point in this time, there's something that really is optimistic in terms of, from my perspective and from my limited understanding and knowledge as a white man, that to me is encouraging. And it's drawing me in to find out, Ken, where can you participate? Where can you be someone who is a positive force in this direction change? With primarily maybe with people who look and come from the same background as I do, who are really struggling a lot to try to figure out why this is happening and what has to happen to slow down the change that seems to be growing.
Yeah. And of course, being older gives you a wider view of what's happening. And one of the things that I really appreciated about a conversation I had with my grandmother, who's approaching 80 or so, and she'll kill me for saying that, but she lived through segregation and integration and all of these things. And she made the comment that, this time it feels different because this time it's mixed. And not to say that there was no white support before, but this time it really is. I mean, you can't say it's majority anything right now because everyone is really involved, which I love. The thing that I'm really pushing, and I'm getting a lot of resistance to, is this idea that the Black Lives Matter movement is as much a movement for white people as it is for Black people. Yeah. And we see the signs. I don't know if you've been out the house, but I've been, traveling since we've been allowed to. And there are billboards up that say, "We are one." And every time I see that billboard, I say, well, who is the we we're talking about? Because they're from various different groups. And I'm like, are we saying we're all one, no matter our race? Or are we saying all of us Black people are one? All us white people, what is the we in that? And so for you watching this, what can you give us by way of your experience just living through now multiple movements? What can you share in this time?
Multiple movements is absolutely right. The first movement I was involved in probably was anti-war movement around Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s. In fact, that was a defining moment for me to establish who I was spiritually and who I was as a citizen of this country. And I ended up taking a direction that was really soul satisfying, but put me in a whole different community. Because I ended up as a conscientious objector and for my faith, and going to Cameroon and West Africa on the Peace Corps mission as part of that. And so it was to me a revealing moment in my life. And then all of the other things that occurred after that were somewhat influential, but they all seem to have very short lives. Any sort of spontaneous outbreak of enthusiasm around change, around equity, around justice, didn't seem to have a momentum, especially around the white cultural world that I pretty much moved in and lived in and worked in. One of the big changes for me was before we moved here 20 years ago. I was part of a small movement in Duluth, Minnesota called Men as Peacemakers, which...
So you were actually in Duluth? That's where you were?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm sorry. I got really excited because I have some friends there, well, teammates now that are in Duluth. So, okay, cool. Keep going.
I was the city engineer there for a number of years, and I was looked on as a community leader, and I was invited to be a part of this Men as Peacemakers group that was primarily looking at domestic violence and as men who committed most of that violence. And that was my first opportunity to work shoulder to shoulder with a multicultural group, a multiracial group of men. And it really energized me as to what men could be and could do when they mobilize with that focus. But I also found that I wasn't as equipped emotionally to move within different cultural groups. And so I took some anti-racism training through a coalition of churches, and again found myself energized by it. But I found myself also sort of brought to task in a way about what am I going to do with that energy, with that knowledge, with that motivation, because I didn't fully understand until a black friend said, Ken, you can open doors that I can't in this community. As a white man who's in a position of influence, you can do a lot more in terms of changing the culture and environment in the world of power than I could. And we were at that time, we were only a few months away of moving here. So that always resonated with me as something, an opportunity that I hadn't stepped into because of this change. And as things come up here, I also look for opportunities to engage and in a way that is authentic for me and that resonates with people as something that is authentic.
Yeah. You mentioned a phrase that I want to dive a little more deeply into, and that's anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And so can you share what it means to be anti-racist versus simply being, I don't really know, neutral or?
Well, it's my understanding, my experience and from what I'm learning is that being neutral is not being anything positive. It's being part of the status quo and part of a resistance to change, where being anti-racism really focuses on something that needs to be focused on, that's a part of, as I see it, every person that's come up through the white culture that has become unconscious in terms of how we behave, how we act, how we communicate. And so to me, it takes the word anti in front of racism in order to have some impact on cutting through some of the, I don't know what the word is for it, the ignorance, the lies, however we've been shaped and molded to believe that separate and equal or separate is better.
Mm. Yeah, I've run into a lot of differing views. And again, before we started the recording, I mentioned there are so many different directions we could go with this. And for those watching that, haven't figured it out, Ken and I are like friends in real life. Yes. So we have, hours long conversations all the time. But we're going to try to limit this to about 35 minutes. But I've seen some of my other friends on Facebook on both sides just really saying, they're tired. Yeah. And one of my friends, he's a younger white guy, and he made a very long post just expressing his pure exhaustion at the fact that he can't get it right. When he tries to learn, when he tries to understand, when he tries to participate, he's called a racist and other terms and things. Now, the author of White Fragility often refers to herself as a racist. She acknowledges that. But I think that the definition of racist is so widely disputed that when some people hear it, they think I'm a Nazi or I'm actively hating Black people. And that's not what they are. But when they are benefiting from the system that has been established, which does provide oppression to people of color, not just Blacks, but all people of color, women, minorities, whether it's orientation or gender identity, when they benefit from that, I think admitting it can be tough. And it does strike a blow because they have genuine hearts and want to be considered good people. Have you run into that struggle where you maybe have had a misstep, or maybe you didn't have a misstep, but you were still labeled a racist because you didn't stand strongly enough against anything?
I have never been called or suggested that I might be racist. I think that's part of my personality, my way of relating to the world. It might be a reason for that, because I'm an introvert. I withdraw a lot of times when there's something that doesn't seem to be comfortable or right at the time. Rather than engaging, I may withdraw. So the biggest criticism for me is if something comes up and there's engagement that's called for, rather than dealing with it right or wrong, in terms of pushing it, I may withdraw and become invisible. So that can be why I might be considered racist, is because I see something and I don't do something about it in terms of advancing something that's not racist, or that helps to change institutional racism.
Right. And that's a defense mechanism, that's self-preservation. And it's a number of reasons why one would do that. And I even find myself walking very cautiously in a lot of different spaces for that reason. I'm not necessarily the most confrontational person. You won't see me in the streets actively protesting with signs and, a megaphone and all of that. That's not my way. I think that's a way, and I think it's valid. So I'm not saying this to minimize the importance of that way. But for me, when I'm most emotional, when I'm reaching the breaking point, the tipping point for myself, I turn to my pen and paper and I'll write about it, or I'll do an interview like this and have a conversation. What I'm finding is there are some people that have made up their mind and cannot be reached. Yeah. It took me a long time to admit that, because I'm very much one of those, there's hope for everyone. And I'm not saying that they'll never be able to be reached, but right now you can spend hours providing data and examples and lived experiences, and they will dismiss it. I had one example where a person told me, well, you keep providing these lengthy, in-depth articles. Why don't you just give me a real life example? And I said, well, I keep giving you these in-depth, lengthy articles because this is a complex issue. But here are 3 real life examples. And then he took my 3 real life lived experience examples and said, well, that's all questionable. Maybe it wasn't really that way. So there was literally nothing I could provide that would be sufficient for this person to acknowledge systemic racism exists. And we couldn't even broach the subject that he was participating in it. So what are your thoughts on those circumstances, and how do you navigate those spaces?
I look for opportunities to engage people when they may drop their guard and show some curiosity around how things might be different from their perception. There was an example that happened recently with a men's group where someone said that they didn't like Muslims. And I said, well, why is that? Do you think? And he said, I don't know. So I said, well, would you like to do a study on it, just to try to get a basic understanding, since you're not sure why? And so we did that, and it was engaging. but that's to me is an opportunity when somebody's actually open to listening about something, and that's where I think I have to keep my eyes and ears and my heart open to listening for that, and to present someone as who's open to listening, to open to engaging. A number of people who I've worked with in the past have said that, Ken, you're a bit of a bridge builder because you've been involved in a number of different communities, spiritual communities as well, and I can understand some languages and reasons why people pursue different directions, and able to converse around it in hopefully a non-threatening and an engaging way. So I'm not looking to push the envelope, I guess, is the way I look at it. But I'm looking for opportunities that may be open to it.
Yeah, I get that. And pushing the envelope is, again, it's not my natural style. And some people would probably disagree. They're like, you are very much out there. But for me, I'm much more about the relationship and having those deep conversations. I love the fact that person was able to admit, I don't like Muslims. Like that, in any 12-step program, like that's the first step, admit that this is what it is. And I think a lot of people, for any number of reasons, aren't ready to admit it, whether it's the fact that they are actually so sensitive that it just breaks their heart and it's too much for them to deal with emotionally, or it's one of those things I used to say when, I was more in the Christian circles about tithing, and that it's beneficial to not question tithing when your paycheck is dependent upon it. So, I think this is kind of one of those similar issues where it's like, yeah, your way of life is so deeply entrenched in the way things are that for them to be changed would literally be life-threatening. And of course, our natural inclination is survival. That's our biological makeup, is to survive. I want to read a quote from a friend of mine that really struck me. And it says, choosing presidents was supposed to make this country special. Now it's the mechanism that's undoing it. What do you think about that?
Wow. Well, that's definitely a conversation starter. And I'm not sure where I would go with it, but it is a good conversation starter that can take me and others maybe down a path of saying, well, what is that all about? What is our system? How is our system changed to so the two-edged sword is moving in a direction we don't want it to move in? So yeah, that's a good question.
What I'm seeing with it didn't just start with this election cycle. It's been building, for several cycles. But what I'm seeing is the goal isn't collaboration. The goal is not advancement or even healing. The goal is winning, and at all costs, which for me is terribly frightening. For the past 6 years here in Las Vegas, I've been ministering on really that bridge building, reconciling type of theme, expressing compassion for all, and really trying to help people to understand our interconnection and interdependence. And then just in the last, 3.5, 4 years, every single month, it seems to get harder and harder to even have those type of conversations, because when you have entities that are literally opposed to your very existence, it's hard to build a bridge there. It's hard to employ empathy and understanding. So for me, I'm really working on how to articulate this in a way that it makes sense to people that maybe don't get it yet. And I'm not just speaking, white people or Black people. This is across the spectrum. They're retreating into their own tribes. And I'm seeing this kind of reemerge. And then alongside that is this rabid individualism, where this idea that what I do only affects me is coming up. And so, for example, we have a major rally that's scheduled to take place this weekend, where you'll have people in an inside space, close together, excited, yelling, passing a virus around. And the leader of this rally won't even suggest putting on a mask. And it kind of stems from two things. The idea that what I do only affects me, but also this idea that it's propaganda that this virus exists. It's propaganda that racism exists, you know? So it's so many different facets that are happening together that it can feel very hopeless. And that was a really long way for me to get to this subject of differing opinions and how you can work through when it seems to be two dead ends. And I think that my experience with you, at least, has been you do a really, really good job of building those bridges and getting to the heart of the matter. So what do you see is the fundamental, like the core issue that's really at play that has caused us to go from presidential elections uniting us as a people to presidential elections potentially being the literal undoing of our nation?
I think it feels like racism is at the core, and with 400 years of slavery and apartheid in this country, and genocide and all of those things that came over from the Atlantic Ocean, primarily. It's coming to a point where it's a tipping point, it feels like to me. And there's a lot of fear and anger, sadness around losing influence in a white culture that is, to me, almost feels so abnormal, like the pendulum is swinging back to something that can no longer exist in this world environment.
I want to pause right there for just a second, because you as a white male are the one that's losing the position. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. I don't want to pretend like, oh, it's just going to be the same for everyone. No, that's not what's happening. When you've been in a position where you're starting at plus 100 from the goal line to be reset to 0, you are losing something. You are, enduring pain and suffering. Like it's very legitimate and real. You mentioned a pendulum as well. What I'm actively preaching about is, let's not swing the pendulum to the other side. Let's reset from center. So you as a white male, how do you feel about being reset to 0? And I don't mean like you lose literally everything, you have nothing, but I mean where the playing field truly is equal and there's no longer an advantage for being a white male or an inherited disadvantage for being Black.
It's emerging as more and more of a deep longing for something like that, for that playing field to be much more level. Because I learn as I've advancing and beginning to see some of the white privilege benefits that I've had over the years and how they have affected others and how they've affected me. It's kind of an ugly picture. So, it feels like a picture that time has come, and that as a process of coming to something that it almost has to be new. It has to be different. It has to be like, okay, there's someone who's promoting the change. There's an opposition to change, and it's a win-lose environment and a win-lose perspective. But there's a third way that can emerge from it, and there's a number of people who keep bringing forth the possibility of this third way that's different from those two ways. And that's what I'm looking forward to. And so how I win or lose in that game, so to speak, isn't going to look like what I think it might look like. And the risk for me is well worth it to know that there's a third way that's going to be much more beautiful than either of the opposites.
So what I just heard you say is it doesn't have to be a win-lose situation. It can be a win-win.
Right.
Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Walk us through this third way a little bit more, because that's the concept I don't know that a lot of people get.
Oh gosh. Well, it takes someone sitting down with the possibility. Well, maybe not even that, getting to that point. Someone who has a position and someone who has a defense for the opposite. First of all, being willing to either be in the same room together, and to be in the same room together, and then to get to the point where you're saying that I don't know how we can get past this. I mean, my first experience with this was back in the 1990s with a model that M. Scott Peck had developed called community building. And the model, which was practiced in a 3-day weekend, was starts with pseudo-community. Everybody's trying to get along with anybody, but not really being honest about how they're feeling about the person across the room, until that gets really boring when you have no agenda to work with. And then chaos begins to ensue, and people start to get angry with each other, and chaos can move and move and move until chaos gets to the point where people begin to say, in this circle environment with no agenda, this is not where I want to go. And someone begins to empty out some of what really is going on with them about the person across the room and how they're feeling. Like someone across the room said to me, I didn't like you when I came to this room, and I don't know what it was about you I didn't like. And just everybody sort of emptying out all of these things, and out of that emptying process of what we brought into the room, community can evolve. And I was in four different weekends, and out of at least 2 of them, maybe 3, community did evolve. But the one extreme one that it didn't revolved around racism. There was a sense of racism in the group that in 3 days they couldn't come to terms with letting go of some things around that as the obstacle.
Wow. I don't know how I feel about that. But I think that that's just a real example of where we are right now. This is that issue. And for there to be this other option where, we really do have honesty and authenticity at the center of our value system, I'm deeply concerned that when someone raises their hand to say, yes, I'm a racist, that instead of being healed, instead of that distortion being cleared up and focused, they're expelled. Yeah. And that's what I am concerned about at this time. I saw, for example, with Starbucks, and I used this example before, but they had a policy where they don't allow political propaganda as part of their uniform. And so when the Black Lives Matter movement started, a lot of their associates were wearing shirts and some other things, and they were like, hey, this is not in line with our uniform policies. Now at the Starbucks I go to, they were literally writing it on their apron, which apparently was fine. They couldn't wear the t-shirts and propaganda that way. And I shouldn't call it propaganda, I should say, a different word. But long story short, I talked to the associates in my store, and they're like, we didn't even know it was an issue till we saw it on the news. So, but by that time, my circle, one of my circles, because I'm in a lot of different ones, but they were like, no, Starbucks is canceled. We don't do Starbucks anymore. And I'm like, but they shifted. They said it's fine now. They recognized it was an issue, and they changed course. Yeah. Then it gets to be, well, they're just changing because they were losing money. Okay, so they like, for me, I'm like, isn't that kind of the point? Like, do you just want to punish them, or do you want to see something actually happen? Why do you think people go to those extremes?
Oh gosh, the extremes in terms of a reaction to that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it provides some drama and support for their point of view. I mean, I really appreciated when I saw one thing on Facebook that said Starbucks won't let them wear these t-shirts, and then 2 days later they're saying Starbucks is providing t-shirts, and I thought, wow, what a beautiful example of how something can change and perspective can change, and so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was a good example of how an organization like Starbucks can change on the fly without having to go through 6 months to a year of processing it.
Right. All these deliberations. Let's test it with groups A and B, So, yeah. is there a way that we can work towards helping people to work from a restorative basis, rehabilitate each other, heal each other versus the punitive, retribution basis? And what I'm really thinking of is the most recent, as of this recording, because I'm sure by the time this comes out, something else will have happened. But in Atlanta, where the officers shot the inebriated Black man in the back as he was running away. Have you heard of that incident?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what I'm seeing is, that officer was charged, which he should have been. And, they've given him some really severe charges, and one of which could end in the death penalty.
Yeah.
In my feed, I've seen everything ranging from he deserves the death penalty to how dare they, even charge him he was assaulted by the offender. Like, I've seen the whole spectrum. And so I posed a question, which I never know which one of my posts is actually going to gain, 1,000 comments. The ones I think are totally like benign, those always get on fire. But this one, I was like, this is a touchy subject. People are going to comment. So I asked, do you want to see this officer healed and restored, or do you want retribution and to see him punished? And I got some inboxes. I understand, not everyone wants their views public, but really it didn't gain a lot of conversation. And I don't know if it's because people just aren't ready to have that conversation, or they don't know where they stand yet, or what happened in it. But I'm interested in your view on how we shift the culture from being punishment oriented to being restorative.
I think that model, the restorative model, is one that came out of South Africa, and the reconciliation councils and that approach that was taken at the time by Desmond Tutu and the Episcopal priests at that time. And it was, to me, that it was difficult to read that too, to read the death penalty suggested for it, because I'm in opposition to the death penalty, because then there's no opportunity for reconciliation or for really recovery. So, but beyond that, I would look to say, let the process unfold without taking that step of killing him in response to that he killed someone else. But I think there is a reconciliation pattern that I'm hearing people say around the country when they use the word defund police departments, like in Minneapolis and other places. That's a good starting point for a conversation, because that gets to a point. The idea is to begin to redistribute resources along professional lines that can help people, rather than take harsh actions that lead to the outcomes that are over the top.
I want to pause for a second and just say that I love this conversation, because you are showing in live and in living color that, your race has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you can truly get what's happening now. And, a lot of your perspective is very, of course, you're very conscious anyway, but it's one of those things that I think is inspiring. And I really hope that particularly the African-American community watches this and sees you and hears this, to know that you're not really just an ally. You're actually part of this evolution, this change, this reckoning, this awakening that our country is going through. And it's not because you have to be. You're retired, you're comfortable. You don't have to participate in this at all. Like, you're fine, but yet you are. So I appreciate that. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about internalized racism. One thing that I've been considering is my own internalized racism. And I didn't think of myself as a racist until white fragility. And, clearly, if anyone's actually watching, they can see I'm not a white person. Lots of melanin here. but I grew up in a white neighborhood. And so for me, even if I didn't grow up in a white neighborhood, because that's the dominant culture, a lot of that is easy to internalize.
Mhm.
And so I've taken pride in the fact that, I prefer opera over rap, but that's kind of because whiteness is the standard. And in all honesty, even if rappers were white, got like Vanilla Ice and Eminem and, other ones, I just don't like rap. And
Yeah.
the way that I sing, it's not suitable for the traditional Black culture. The instrument that God gave me is more appropriately suited in a classical setting. That's just the way I was made. And so a lot of what people would say is internalized racism isn't. It
Mhm.
is just the way that I am. And I'm also conscious that, like, I take pride in the fact that, my circle is very diverse, and I do have more white friends than Black friends. But it's not from a place of, I think that Black people are less worthy, or, there's anything wrong. But just in this climate, it makes me analyze it. And I'm very reflective anyway. Like, I think about things. So I'm just wondering, what are your observations in that sphere around internalized racism within the African American community?
Wow, within the African American community, that put a whole new twist on it for me, because I was just moving to saying, well, I know it's internalized in me because of what I know about myself and where I grew up in the environment I came out of. But internalized in the African American community, um, it's something I guess I haven't had to or thought about either. It's, again, another part of my experience of not having to think about what an African American, Hispanic, Asian American person has to think about in order to move freely, comfortably, and upwardly mobile in this culture. And so you caught me with not knowing if I
No,
have a
it's
thought
good.
on it.
I'm glad that, that's what this is. This is a candid conversation, no script
Right.
here. But it is something that it's a new thought for me too. And I've really wrestled with, how do I communicate in a way where I can be heard? And I know not everyone's going to hear, like, I get that, but by as broad of a group as possible. I don't want to alienate anyone. And I'll use an example of, my church. So the church that I came out of was often kind of ridiculed by the Black, air quotes, community, because the pastor was intentionally multicultural. And what he recognized is white people would attend the church if they saw other white people on stage. But Black people would attend a white church even if there were no Black people on stage. And so he recognized that, and he started the church in, I think, the 70s, something like that. But he was able to build a relatively multicultural ministry that way. But one of the things that constantly came up was the choice of music, because he intentionally made sure there were all styles of music present. And so when I started my church in Vegas, I did the same thing. And I'm like, well, this is my preference. And so we're going to do this style. This is other people's preference. So we're going to include that. And it becomes this melting pot, but yet not really. And what I mean by that is, you attempt to bring the cultures together, but what happens is you see them participate with their style versus engaging in the different style. And I don't know if I'm being clear in what I'm getting to, but the idea is, a lot of people will flock to their preference and say that they're open-minded and say that they are inclusive, when really they're more just tolerant. Does that make any sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially, I guess, in a church where there's a welcoming mat put out saying everyone's welcome. But if it comes down to a person of color or the Black American, I think there would be a point, as a friend of mine who is black, said if the percentage of black folk got to a certain point, like even 20%, there would be a real sense of discomfort, because the whole idea was, okay, this is our church as a white culture. You're welcome to come in, but this is the way we do things. So if you're going, you can be here and participate, but we have the rules. We have the rule book on how things are supposed to be done. And until that rule book changes and becomes something that's a third way, it's going to be more a level of tolerance than acceptance, I think, by people who are coming from different directions.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between tolerance and acceptance?
Tolerance for me is saying, okay, I'm not sure I like that person or that idea, but I'm recognizing that there's so much momentum building around the culture that I'm part of to make space for the other, that I will tolerate that intrusion on my space. Whereas acceptance to me is saying, okay, as that other moves in to be with me or in that space, I begin to understand, I begin to hear the story that's different as well as the same as mine. I begin to have a sense of respect for that individual. And so at some point, I move to a point of accepting that person as it could be a friend, an equal, or a confidant even, or someone that have a deep relationship with. So to me, there's quite a difference, and tolerance is only works, I think, until something goes wrong in the relationship, or the group with the more influence decides that they don't want the other group anymore.
Do you think there's a fear among the white community that should blacks gain equal footing or even more, that they would then experience something like that?
Yes, I think there is a deeper sense of an experienced loss. And I think there is a deeper sense of maybe retribution for 400 years of slavery and genocide. And I don't think you can wipe that away, because I think it just kind of, it's part of the DNA as it gets fed through from one generation to the next, that is there in the unconscious. And until we began to do what I think we were talking about earlier, is me as a white person say, oops, yeah, what I said, what I did is racist. Okay, I learned from that little step. That's one out of 100 steps I need to take in order to begin to let go of that conditioning that's built into me.
I think that's a big point, which is acknowledging when you make a
Yeah.
mistake, and that you have more to come. Like, this is just one step in the right direction. I've been focused a lot on saying, let's reset America. I don't necessarily, and this is a political statement, but it's not. I don't think we can make America great again, because there's, in my history as a people, going back to my ancestors, there's no point to go back when it was great. It just does not exist for us. I want to reset things. So I'm not about restoring America, revitalize, none of those re's, which means to make again.
Right.
But I'm about reset. Let's fundamentally change our structure and our systems.
Yes.
Which means there's going to be some work. And I don't know how long it will take. I think it's possible to happen overnight. Like, we can just wake up tomorrow and like everybody gets it. I think that is possible. I know it's not likely.
Yeah.
What could you say that would get us closer to that reset? Or what would you offer? Conversations
as broad as you can imagine. One of the things that I've been facilitating at the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada on our monthly noon meetings is a topic of consider a kinder conversation. And with that conversation, what comes up for us when we're dealing with something that we oppose or somebody that's different to us? What emotions come up and how do we deal with it? And what opens us up to look at another way of looking at the possibility? So we've been on that topic for 3 months now, and it seems to be a topic that people really engage with. Now, this is a really limited number of, say, 15 people who are coming because they want to engage. So how do we start spreading that circle out to people who will say, well, maybe I could engage in it, or someone else farther out is saying, I don't think I can do that, or someone farther out saying, I could never engage with that. Somehow keep widening that circle until there's enough momentum so that it begins to influence policy and practice at the local and state and county, state and national levels. That seems to be kind of what I'm feeling like, and looking at what the protesters are doing on the streets around this country and around the world is when they throw things out that are just sort of brand new words like defund or wow, that's a conversation starter.
Yeah.
So that's what I think has to happen. Somehow there needs to be conversation that begins in order to begin to get relationships built and momentum built around possible resetting.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's in the conversations. And I think it starts with people having conversations with their people. And I don't mean that just on a racial line. I mean, have in your circle where you see these issues, address it. And that's uncomfortable because you like your people because you guys are all kind of comfortable together. And to bring tension into that is frightening. Yeah. One thing you sparked for me in your comment was a lot of people don't believe something until they see it for themselves. Whether we're talking about the, COVID-19, I think it's a hoax because nobody I know got it, or any other situation. And I think hope may be a similar experience for some people. What I see is a lot of people calling the utopia a pipe dream. You guys are so far-fetched that could never happen. And my question is, why can't it happen? I always ask, do you want that? I mean, what fundamentally is wrong with this vision? What do you see? What do you have disagreement in these end goals? And what I get to is, I don't think it's possible. That's their answers. I don't think it's possible because I haven't seen it. You guys are living in a dream world that can't happen. But I've never met with someone that says, you know what, I do want to live in a world full of racists. So I think it's one of those, to quote my favorite, Michael Jackson, starts with the man in the mirror.
Yeah. And
what's attributed to Gandhi, be the change. I think all of those things matter. So expanding that circle of hope, that circle of compassion, those kinder conversations, and teaching people how to have disagreement without being disagreeable, yes, I think is something that we all can engage in. I hope that this work that I'm doing is giving people hope. I know if I was to see this and see you sharing in this moment, it would at least give me, if not a full spark of hope, at least a glimmer. So I really appreciate that in your time today and meeting Zoom. In our last minute or so, is there any final words you want to share? Anything you want to put out and hope people grab?
The biggest thing for me, I think, goes back to how do I engage with people who I either in the past been afraid to engage with, or found no need to engage with, or no desire to engage with. How do I cross over myself and begin to let go of something that says, I'm going to be open to at least listening to that. And that to me is a starting point for me too. And to take my thoughts and my emotions and turn them into some sort of action that makes a difference in my life and others. And it sounds grand and expansive and maybe to some undoable, but it's very hopeful to me. And I
Me
very
as
much
well.
appreciate this conversation that we've had and the relationship that we've had in exploring these things together.
I as well. So we'll leave it there for now.
Okay.